So let's talk about the Crusading Knights of Sigismund and their new codex and rules that they'll be using to purge the stars clean in the name of the Emperor. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Black Templars, and in this video I thought we'd do a full overview of the new codex, talking through the core rules for these Crusading Knightly Space Marines with a look at their core faction rule, detachments and datasheets. The Black Templars so far have had some ups and downs throughout the course of 10th edition. I feel like as they go their index was a pretty reasonable one, enough rules to make them interesting, and then since then their fortunes have varied a bit depending on whether or not Games Workshop gave them generous points costs or not. It's quite nice to get a bunch of updated rules and different attachments to fill them in though. I feel like the Codex has certainly changed things up for the faction in a fairly big way. Lots of interesting shifts to the datasheets and the leader characters in particular, a few added in Templar unique versions and some new characters, and 3 detachments that feel fairly different to the previous index one, and a replacement to Oath of Moments that gives you a big damage buff against a whole bunch of tough stuff. At time of recording, the book is releasing this week, the Codex supplement functioning as an expansion for core Codex Space Marines, and the new miniatures for the Crusade Ancient with the Orky Skull banner, and the Execrator Chaplain hurling himself into battle with a Pyre Pistol. They also have the Combat Patrol box set for them, which I feel like is a particularly good one really. Both unique infantry, an Emperor's Champion and some Blade Guard. Nothing really to criticise models wise there, and certainly feels like a box set that you could get multiple of, kit bashing the Emperor's Champion into another character with bits from the Blade Guard or Sword Brethren. If you are looking to pick up any of the new Templar releases, the video sponsored Toy Snowman could help with that. They're 15% off in Canada, and I'll talk about them a bit more later. The link's down in the video description. And then also links below are all the channel's other affiliate discount retailers. They can save various amounts around the globe, usually between 15 and 20% off Games Workshop prices. If you're watching this early, then here are the pre-order times for Friday nights to Saturday morning. The boxes and new models go on sale at midnight Eastern Time in North America, and then between 10 and 12 around the rest of the world. As ever, a big thank you to anyone supporting the channel via picking stuff up via them. It does support the videos I create. Let's jump into it though, and Codex Supplement Black Templars has the normal things that you might expect of these. Games Workshop has done similar for 3 of the other Divergent Space Marine chapters in 10th edition. There's the usual lore segments and miniature galleries. There's the Crusade content, which is all very appropriate for the narrative gameplay for the Black Templars, and the new Combat Patrol rule set for the new one with the Emperor's Champion in it. As usual for my reviews, I'll be focusing on the core rules for the army, and these are the Templar Vows, unusually replacing the Oath of Moment with their own bespoke mechanic. There's a section called Heirs of Sigismund, which is the army construction section. The Templars have a few of their own peculiarities with the different datasheets they can access and can't. There's 3 detachments, each of which have 4 enhancements and 6 stratagems, and they can access the other ones in core Codex Space Marines. And then they've got 18 datasheets. That one includes the 2 new character miniatures they've had for this release, the Crusade Ancient and the Execrator Chaplain. 3 more variant units from Codex Space Marines, but they have lost the Firstborn Crusader units. As with most of the Firstborn, they're likely going to be sent to Legends. There's also a points cost section within this book, which will be available fairly shortly after via digital downloads. I'll talk about those on the channel when we have them. Let's jump straight into it though, and first up we have the Templar Vows. If your army is a Black Templar army, which means they're either using a datasheet of theirs or one of their unique detachments, then you basically replace Oath of Moment with Templar Vows on all your units. It means that Black Templars won't be able to just mark one unit for 4 rerolls to hit against them, which certainly is a powerful buff, though I feel like just one of the vows in particular is enough to rival that. Overall though, it's going to mean that the Black Templars are more heavily dedicated towards fighting in glorious close combat, as opposed to focusing fire with massive firepower. In any case, you pick one of these 4 vows at the start of the game. Pretty much the same mechanic as the previous Righteous Crusaders detachment rules, but this frees up the detachments to have some other bonus stuff to add on top of this. You choose one of 4 options, and then all of your units that had Oath of Moment will be affected by them. First up, we have Uphold the Honor of the Emperor. This one gives your infantry unit sticky objectives, triggering at the end of the command phase as per normal, and the opponent can cancel it if they control the objective at the end of the phase, but until that point the objective remains yours, and it can give you some interesting options like marking the objective with your troops and then using your squad to move off it and press the fight to the enemy if it makes sense to. Infantry can also do actions after advancing as well, which certainly could be relevant for flexible positioning from time to time. Definitely nice enough on the secondary game. Both of these boosts do seem like they'd add reasonable value but seem a bit niche, perhaps in particular because Intercessors are a good unit. They've got some alright anti-horde damage output, and then for 80 points you can basically have sticky objectives in the army anyway, marking your home field, and then even maybe moving them towards the midfield to do stuff there later on. I feel like this one is maybe one that you could consider going for If you happen to be playing against an enemy army that say got all toughness 3 models and your damage boost one isn't going to trigger. Talking of which, the standout highlight and pretty much default pick for these vows is accept any challenge no matter the odds, and this one is a pretty straightforward and powerful melee damage buff. Each time your unit makes a melee attack, if the strength characteristic of that attack is less than or equal to the toughness characteristic of the target, then you add +1 to the wound roll. It's just really good for the Black Templars' most standard units. The Crusader Squads and the Sword Brethren are both reasonably scary melee squads, and they're both fairly low strength, strength 4 and strength 5. For the things that you already wound on a 3+, you're already good against those, and this means that you just get good against all the stuff that you're not normally so effective against. Chainswords can be wounding knights on a 5+, and Sword Brethren strength 5 melee weapons will have lethal hits and a +1 to wounds to help them out against tougher targets as well. Even for strength 4 melee going into things like standard Space Marines, you're going to be wounding them on a 3 as well, and the Sword Brethren helps out a good deal against Terminator equivalents with this. Overall, it just feels like a really powerful and useful army rule, can affect multiple units on different sides of the board. Oath of Moment can only affect one target, and certainly incentivizes you to take a good amount of fairly low strength melee units, as they're going to be effective against most things anyway. Perhaps one criticism is that it makes standard chaplains a touch redundant. They might still be able to get the +1 to wound against things you wounded on a 3+, maybe makes you more tempted to either take the Execrator Chaplain datasheet or the Judaseer. Otherwise, beyond that, the others feel pretty niche. There's Abhor the Witch, Destroy the Witch. This one allows you to reroll charges against Psyker keyword units and get precision melee against the Psyker units. It maybe could be okay against Thousand Sons or Librarius Conclave perhaps. You basically have to have an army where the accept any challenge one just isn't going to have any value, so really low toughness, and then have enough Psykers to make it relevant. Then there's Suffer Not the Unclean to Live. This one allows you to fall back and charge, which is handy enough for a melee-focused army, and you can pile in towards the closest enemy units rather than closest enemy model. That one's handy enough for massed-up melee squads and trying to get them all into the fight. Again, not awful, but just kind of peripheral to your main army's function. I think between the utility of those and the fact that you can get sticky objectives with intercessors, it's going to be kind of rare that armies aren't taking accept any challenge just for the sheer brutal hitting power. Overall though, it feels good to see that they genuinely have a rule that will rival Oath of Moment. It does kind of feel like if they were going to make one of the vows quite this powerful though, then the other ones should have been better to actually have some sort of rivalry for it. Feels like the illusion of choice might just be a trap to get you to pick something worse unless you're literally fighting against nothing but toughness 3. It'll definitely mean that you're wanting to take more melee Black Templars though, as opposed to more ranged units that might have been more viable if you had Oath of Moments to amp up their damage. Next up and alongside that, there's a section on Black Templar army construction, and this one's more sort of housekeeping for the units that you're allowed to take and not. To be a Black Templar's army, you either must take at least one Black Templar unique datasheet, or use one of their 3 unique detachments, and then if you do, you swap out the Oath of Moment for the Templar Vows as mentioned, and you're locked out of taking certain units from non-Black Templar chapters. That's just normal, so no mixing and matching chapters on the board and taking, say, Guilliman or Dante or whatever. You can't take any Adeptus Astartes Psykers, no Law Heresy Templar Librarians here, and you can't use the First Company Task Force detachment as well, as that one focuses on Oath of Moment for its core rule. Though to be honest, with the bad rules that Games Workshop gave it, standard Space Marines can't use that effectively either. Then there's also a bunch of Templar datasheets that are locked out. You basically can't take the core Codex versions of the Templar pattern tanks that can opt to take the multi-melters. So that's the Impulsors, Repulsors and Gladiator tanks. And it's not able to take Land Raider Crusaders or Sternguard Veterans, as they have their own datasheet variants in Codex Black Templars, basically a buffed version of the Land Raider Crusader, and a Sternguard Veteran squad that has a special rule that doesn't rely on Oath of Moment to function. Core rules and army construction aside though, next up we have the detachments. In the Codex there's 3 detachments in total. The Vindication Task Force, which is focused on reclaiming and purifying the galaxy, with a lot of focus on the ancient datasheet weirdly enough. There's the Godhammer Assault Force, which is transport focused, nice enough for Sternguard jumping out of Impulsors, though particularly units jumping out of Land Raiders. And then there's the Companions of Vehemence. This one's melee assault Templar focused themes, and plays into Chaplains and Judaseers leading their Templar charges into battle. I guess they're units that the Templars are particularly well known for. On top of that, their 4th unique detachment is the Wrathful Procession. This is the one that they gained in the Grotmus detachment ones. This gives you a choice of different litanies of battle, with a +2 to move, a +1 strength and a 5+ invulnerable save. It was rather overshadowed when it came out though, basically seeming like a worse version of Righteous Crusaders. On top of this, you can use all of the core Codex Space Marine detachments as well. Out of these ones, the Gladius Task Force still probably is going to be the most useful one. Advance and charge, reactive moves, some shooting buffs, and fight on death and things are really quite a good list of support for the Templars. There's plenty of others that could have some interest for them though. Stormlance with advance and charge and reactive moves. Ironstorm with their tanks with the multi-melters on, quite like the rerolls. Vanguard's nice enough for skirmishing infantry of just about any stripe. And Firestorm could also have some interest as well, with all their unique vehicle datasheets with multi-melters once again. Getting into the detachment rules proper though, first up we have the Vindication Task Force. This one's themed around purifying and purging the galaxy in the name of the Emperor, or Ray Templar there, and it seems that the Templars particularly want to plant their banners in this one. Given that so many of their rules focus around their ancients, this one does feel like a bit of a blatant nudge towards trying to get people to buy that new ancient in my opinion. It's not that they aren't iconic to Space Marines in general, but just odd to have a whole detachment quite so focused around literally one miniature, rather than just all the Marshals, Castellans, Chaplains and things that the Templars are known for. In any case, their core rule is called Purge and Sanctify. This one gives you a -1 to wound for ancient-led units within range of an objective marker, and on top of that, Crusader Squads can use Righteous Zeal towards the closest objective marker, so when they're shot they can rush over there, as opposed to just rushing towards the nearest enemy unit with their Righteous Zeal surge move. Out of those, the -1 to wound seems like the more obviously useful thing. Basically, you could have big bricks of 20 strong Crusaders march up to the midboard and then be unusually hard to kill there. Most of the things that are going to be a serious threat to them are going to be wounding them on a 3+ or better. They don't get the -1 to wound against things where the strength is lower than their toughness characteristic. Grimalders could make a squad tougher, and there's a -1 to hit stratagem in here as well, so between that quite a lot of ways to make them harder to kill. And then I guess the surge moves could help them get there in a pinch. It is quite nice to have multiple different options with that. Sometimes just barreling straight into the nearest enemy unit isn't actually going to be all that great, particularly if it's just going to be something that wipes you out anyway. In the right situation, it might even allow your squad to get to safety by running away from a charge or getting behind terrain or something. It is going to be situational though, and it's not really going to be something to plan around so much. Overall doesn't seem like nothing, but seems a little weak as a core rule, just mainly because it requires you to really go for one ancient datasheet that might not necessarily be the first choice for the unit compared with all the other characters that you could have. Before we move on to stratagems and enhancements and things, I'll just quickly cycle back for a shout out to Toy Snowman, the video sponsor. Basically, if you happen to live in Canada, they're a discount retailer with 15% off Warhammer 40K miniatures. Quite a big game store with a whole bunch of other collectibles and things. They had a lot of popularity and success with the Joy Toy 40K miniatures. They now stock quite a good amount of the Games Workshop range at a good discount. These guys are based in Montreal at this address, and they do the standard sort of discount retailer things. They have a loyalty reward program where you can get some more money off, and a free shipping threshold at 150 Canadian dollars if you want to get a few boxes together. Their web store is pretty straightforward for searching. You can find it down in the video description. If there's Games Workshop things that they don't happen to have in stock, then you can get in touch with them via this email address to backorder stuff, so basically any Games Workshop item at their discount. In general, they tend to go fairly big in for the Warhammer 40k pre-orders as well, so they should be getting a fair bit of stock of Black Templars, Space Wolves and Tyranid combat patrols for the weekend, plus some of the new characters and their shiny new combat patrol, so it could be a way to save some money there if you happen to live in Canada. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. You can check them out, links down in the video description below, alongside the other channel affiliates linked in the video description. Getting back to the stratagems for the Banner Bearer led detachment though. First up for one command point, we've got Refusal to Yield. You trigger this one the first time that an ancient model is slain, and you set it back up at the end of the phase with 4 wounds remaining. I feel like basically guaranteeing that a character survives the phase is always going to have at least some value, and I guess the army is likely to have a good amount of them just due to triggering the detachment rule. In the right situation could be well worth it though, giving you a unit that could still be holding a central objective, be in the position to do some secondary objectives, or maybe do one last turn of damage dealing. They aren't exactly the biggest powerhouse damage dealers in melee, but the Crusade Ancient hits perhaps harder than you might expect, and the Terminator Ancient has some alright stats, and this could also be an insurance against the model getting precisions down, as if they got sniped then your durability buffs would go away. For one command point, there's Litanies of Purgation. This one gives you an extra AP in the fight phase if your unit or their target is on an objective marker. It feels hard to go too far wrong with that. Nice and easy extra damage boosts for both Crusaders and Sword Brethren. Crusaders with all those attacks going to AP -2 and then wounding everything or at least a 5+ is pretty big. Just about any unit in the game is going to take some serious chip damage. AP3 Sword Brethren or Blade Guard are great, could even be useful on other skirmishing things like Jump Intercessors. You're not going to be able to use it all the time, as if units aren't on objective markers then it won't work, but perhaps particularly in this detachment it's common enough that you'll likely be fighting over them. Next up, for one command point, we've got Spore of the Unholy. This one basically allows you to ignore modifiers, either to weapon skill or ballistic skill, or to your hit rolls, and you also get to ignore cover if it happens to be a ranged attack. That kind of depends on the target, I suppose. I guess basically it undoes enemy vehicles using smoke if you use this, though otherwise it's going to be a bit more dependent on the opponent, whether they're in cover and whether or not they have stealth or another -1 to hit style rule. For one command point, we've got Reclaim Our Honor. When an ancient model is destroyed and doesn't use the revival stratagem, he gets to nominate one unit that he can see before he is removed, and then your army is +1 to hit against that unit for the rest of the game. I guess in this detachment again, if you have a lot of ancients running around, then it might be one that you have the opportunity to use at least. For the first time that they die, you'd either have the choice of using this or the revival stratagem, so maybe a little bit competing for value there. You could use this the final time that they get shot down though. It could be quite a powerful one if you're able to mark a great big central unit, a big block of Terminators or a Knight or something. It's just going to have to be judged on the situation and a bit dependent on which units you've got in your army that could take good advantage of it. Weapon skill 2+ Sword Brethren aren't going to care. For one command point, we've got Recitation of the Revered. This is the one that makes an ancient keyword unit -1 to hit in the enemy shooting phase. Basically doubling down on the detachment rule there to make them yet tougher. That's to be -1 to hit and wound if they're on a central objective as well, and you budget for this. -1 to hit is nice enough, though won't be particularly effective against things that get a lot of value from sustained or lethal hits. Maybe one that feels just alright value but not particularly enormous. Finally, for 2 command points, there's quite a powerful one in Perfervid Intervention. This one allows you to charge out of sequence essentially. At the end of the enemy charge phase, your unit can declare a charge on a unit within 6 inches. As with Heroic Intervention, you don't get any charge bonus for doing this, and the advantage versus Heroic Intervention is that the enemy unit that's the target of your charge doesn't have to have charged themselves, so basically if the opponent doesn't want to be in melee, they need to stay at least 6 inches away from your unit. In reality, it could be even more than that for, say, Crusader Squads with their surge move mechanics. If they move towards the enemy, then it might put them in range for doing this. In the right situation, if it just allows you to step up and delete an enemy unit, then that's going to be a big deal. Easily worth the 2 command points if so, though it maybe is in the opponent's control at least a little bit as to whether or not you're able to do this, and it will eat up some command points that could be used on other options. It's definitely got some intimidation factor and could have some value if the opponent's having to play around it too. Then for the enhancements, first up we've got Consecrating Aura, which is printed at 25 points in Codex. Models in the bearer's unit gain a 5+ invulnerable save. Not a terrible durability buff, but maybe not crazy standout. You need to have at least an AP -3 attack to trigger it, and even then if your unit's got cover then it might not be relevant then either. At 25 points it seems a little bit borderline for most things, probably best on Primaris Crusader Squads, in particular because the Neophytes have a 4+ armor save and it's just going to be so much more relevant for them. Feels like it does stack rather well with the potential -1 to wound and maybe -1 to hit as well that a unit could have. Quite a lot of barriers to damage there, even if you don't have the big feel no pains. I would bear in mind that these detachments don't have Armour of Contempt either, so you can't be worsening the enemy AP. Next up we've got Imperialis of the Eternal Crusade. This one's printed at 15 points, obviously that might change. This one's locked to an ancient model, and it gives your unit a -2 to charge. Maybe a bit scattergun as to how useful it's really going to be. If the opponent is forced to make a sort of mid-range charge though, it could genuinely give them a lesser chance of getting in. Feels like it could be handy enough to have on the front line. At 15 points feels a bit take or leave really. Maybe could be an alright points filler. Next up, and perhaps one of the most fun ones that's also really cheap, is the Orb of the Emperor's Aegis. This one allows you to deep strike for just 10 points as printed. That one is quite a fun one. It could allow ranged units to alpha strike in a big way, maybe dropping down some Hellblasters or Eradicators if you wanted to, or could allow some rapid ingress shenanigans for Sword Brethren potentially. Finally, we've got Warden of Honor. This one's printed at 20 points. This one allows the Crusade Ancient's Fights on Death ability to be boosted to a 3+. Feels like this one is quite a nice enhancement that is solidly meaningful. That's going to be quite a chunk of the squad that is allowed to fight on death if the opponent has to wipe them out in melee. But on the other hand, for the actual increase it is for the points, that feels far more borderline. You'd still be having half of them fight on death even without this. So say in a 10-man Sword Brethren squad it might be an extra 1 or 2 of them. Definitely not nothing, but at the same time it's not enormous. That's presuming that the unit isn't just shot down anyway. Overall for this one, it does feel like there's some fun stuff. It seems basically set up so you'd have multiple big Crusader squads with Ancients in them, marching towards the midboard and then being hard to kill. The -1 to wound core rule is pretty useful. The extra AP damage buff is quite nice. The 2 command points reactively charge in the enemy's turn is a particularly good one. Could make units very scary to get anywhere near. And for the enhancements, the Deep Strike one seems like a winner. You could make some interesting combos with that one. Feels like it's probably playable, though I guess it's probably not going to be the strongest of the Templar detachments. Next up, we've got transport-focused Templars with the Godhammer Assault Force. The theming for this one is Black Templars jumping out of transports. They're certainly well known for their mechanised assaults with their land-raided Crusaders that's got the new and updated boosted datasheets in the book. And I guess it doesn't hurt that they have their own multi-melter bolt-on versions of the Impulsor and the Repulsors as well. The core rule for this one has buffs for units jumping out of transports, a +1 to hit rolls and melee for units that disembarked this turn. So typically Space Marines are going to be hitting on a 2+ there, and when you nominate charges for targets as well, one enemy unit has to immediately test Battle Shock. So that could potentially prevent some stratagems. As a detachment rule, I'd probably say it's okay as opposed to standout strong. Probably the most annoying thing about the hit roll buff is that the Sword Brethren are mainly hitting on a 2+ anyway, and they feel like the single best units that would really like to be jumping out of transports and hitting things hard. Otherwise though, I guess it could be handy enough for Blade Guards, and Crusader Squads would certainly enjoy it as well. The Battle Shock thing feels like it's a nice to have, perhaps particularly just because it generates at least a fair few tests just passively, and you don't really have to do anything particularly different to trigger it. Every so often it could turn off some stratagems or stop the opponent contesting a secondary objective or something. In general, the Battle Shock bit's still going to be a bit on the niche side though. I believe from the timing of it, you'd be able to have the chance to turn off Overwatch if they fail the Battle Shock thing too, though most of the time they would have already had the opportunity to do that in the movement phase. For the stratagems for the Godhammer Assault Force, first up we've got Ceaseless Cause for 1 CP. You use this at the end of the fight phase, and you use it on one unit that was eligible to fight, but now is no longer in engagement range, so normally that means for a unit that's wiped out an enemy unit in close combat, and then that unit can immediately make a 6-inch normal move, and you can use it to embark in the transport, but only if they didn't disembark this turn. So say for example you could have some Sword Brethren disembark from a transport, hit an enemy unit really hard, hopefully wipe it out, and then use your 6-inch move to try and get somewhere to safety, maybe behind a ruin or somewhere further away from the enemy, or move on to an objective potentially. Hopefully if things are going at least somewhat well for the Black Templars, you should be having the chance to use this given that you'll be charging in and making kills. And 6 inches worth of movement feels like it's going to be useful enough to warrant this sometimes. For 1 command point, there's Uncompromising Egress. Units can disembark 6 inches from a Land Raider that didn't move, and when they disembark directly into engagement range if desired. Given the whole point of the Land Raider is for it to move, drop and then charge, this one seems really quite niche. It does give you a few more options though. It might extend your threat range a bit if the target that you need to charge is on the other side of a piece of terrain that the Land Raider can't move through, though there is an option for that I guess. It could potentially prevent Overwatch by putting units directly into melee. Could be quite nice with a Judas here I suppose to still have the fights first, or just maybe have a better disembark location. Say if the enemies are right up to the Land Raider and they're screening parts out. Lots of ways in which it theoretically could be useful, though I feel like most of the time it's just going to make more sense to just jump them out and start killing stuff, and usually after the Land Raider's removed to make use of its special rule. For 1 command point, there's Gauntlet of the God Emperor. A vehicle can move through all terrain features horizontally in your movement phase. Again, with this detachment and transport focus, this one's pretty excellent for Land Raiders, as often the theoretical threat range out of a Land Raider could be decreased a whole load if you do need to be skirting the edges of ruins and things. It could be pretty nice for other stuff as well, maybe in particular Dreadnoughts trying to get into melee, stomping through a ruin wall and making shorter charges. Just in general pretty handy to have for a vehicle heavy detachment. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Focused Hatred. This one allows you to charge through enemy models for a unit that disembarked this turn. I guess potentially useful enough to get through screening units, presuming the target isn't too far back to catch beyond that screening squad. In the right situation, that could be big. Feels like there will be plenty of games where that just doesn't come up though as something that you really need. Sometimes you might be able to theoretically leapfrog a frontline unit, but the squad behind it might be a long way away, and you have to spend the stratagem before you even know whether you're making the charge. It still could add some good options though. For 1 command point, there's Condemnatory Info Screed. This one's quite a nice damage buff one, re-rolling wound rolls of 1 in the fight phase if your own unit disembarked, or all wound rolls if you disembarked from a Land Raider. For 1 command point, re-rolling wounds of 1 is just a little weak for 1 command point. I feel like even on a fairly central melee damage dealer that's going to be hard to justify. Feels like it's mainly one for the Land Raider data sheets. For re-rolling the wound roll is great, and in particular with the new +1 to wound special rule, that means that you'll be wounding everything in the game on a 5+ at least. So with this stratagem thrown in, then literally any Black Templar unit wounds anything most of the time. That's That seems great both for Crusader Squad, Sword Brethren and any other Space Marine melee. It does have a little bit of overlap with the Land Raider Crusaders new special rule if you're using that particular variant though. That one would already have you reroll wound rolls of 1, but trading up to 4 wound rerolls is still a massive gain. Finally, for 2 command points, there's Blessed Hull. This one's -1 to damage a vehicle in the shooting phase, declared when the enemy first nominates it as a target. 2 command points is a big pricey one, you're not going to be able to do it all the time, but really good for an extra tanky Land Raider or Vindicator perhaps, and I guess particularly if the opponent's trying to destroy it with a bunch of damage 2 weapons where you literally halve the firepower. Maybe a bit of a shame that it's only an anti-shooting one as opposed to a melee durability buff, that will be kind of handy to have. At range I guess it will be competing against Smoke for the 1 command point for a reactive durability stratagem. I feel like some of the time that's probably going to be more efficient, and again this detachment won't be able to use Armour of Contempt, which most of the other Space Marine detachments will be able to access. Then for enhancements we've got Paragon of Fury. This one's printed at 25 points. It gives a +2 strength to the bearer's melee weapons, and then an extra +1 damage to melee weapons if the bearer disembarked as well. In particular, the +1 damage on the disembarked charge seems solidly scary to me. Any Templar melee character is going to get on well with that. In particular, something like a standard captain could do well. That's to give him 8 attacks at strength 10, AB 2, damage 3 and devastating wounds in his boosted turn. For a 25-point enhancement though, it does drop off really quite a lot after they've disembarked though. I feel like there's plenty of other detachments out there that pay for just permanent extra damage for the entire game, never mind if they're jumping out of transports or not. There's Battle Psalm, which is printed for 10 points. This one's a small boost to the detachment rule, an extra -1 to those battle shock tests caused by the bearer's unit when they're about to charge in. Not great, but maybe an option as a points filler. There's the Augury Servo Host, which is printed at 15 points. This one's an interesting one, as it could mark targets for other Black Templar shooting. At the start of the phase, you choose one target that's within 12 inches and visible to the bearer, and that target loses the benefit of cover. In theory, this one could be quite a fun one to focus a bunch of firepower on one unit. You would need to have at least a fairly shooty Black Templar list to make good use of it. Maybe something that's going to be a little bit underpowered compared with other Space Marine chapters doing similar, at least without Armour of Contempt. Still though, I guess if you've got a bunch of tanks venturing forward, so a bunch of Land Raider fire and transport and maybe some Templar variant tanks, this could be quite nice as an easy way to get some extra value. Maybe it could be an interesting one for the combi weapon lieutenant to bear. He feels like the sort of model that might be able to survive close enough to the enemy to make use of that for a couple of turns. Or I guess perhaps put on a fighty character that's going to be just charging up the board and getting into the midst of the enemy anyway, and then throwing the debuff on another enemy unit that could take some firepower. At 15 points it feels like it could be useful, but would be far more powerful if it didn't have quite such a short range. Finally for the enhancements, there's the Herald of the Sacred Slaughter. This one's printed at 15 points. This one seems like really quite a nice one. If embarked in a dedicated transport vehicle, that vehicle gains Scout 9 inches, so a very big Scout move there. That one seems kind of made for a character along with a Fighty Sword Brethren or Blade Guard veteran squad in an Impulsor. It's dedicated transport and not regular transport, so that means that you wouldn't be able to scout Land Raiders forward. But still though, if that one remains 15 points, then that is easily worth it. Able to make it into a battlefield bunker to charge out of either turn 1 or turn 2, maybe taking up residence in a mid-board ruin if you want to stay safer. Overall, between all that, there's certainly some good stuff, though a fair few of the options just feel a touch on the frustrating side. They don't really work optimally on the units that you'd really like them to work on. Maybe in particular the detachment rule not really helping out Sword Brethren or characters that hit on 2s already. I say for some of the standout strengths of this one, I guess Blade Guard hitting on 2+ or Crusader Squads jumping out of a Land Raider hitting hard would be nice. The full reroll to wounds out of a Land Raider is a solid boost and another really big incentive to take those. Vehicles moving through terrain is a nice easy one to gain loads of movement and value, and the 6-inch normal move after wiping out an enemy unit could be a handy one in keeping your unit safe from reprisals. For the enhancements, the extra damage one could be worth it jumping out of an Impulsor, maybe for a Space Marine captain as mentioned. I feel like the strongest one for the points cost though is that Scout 9 inches for a dedicated transport. That one's just super easy to use on a Sword Brethren or Blade Guard squad in an Impulsor. Overall it certainly seems like an interesting detachment to me. It already feels like Black Templars get on rather well with transport vehicles, Sword Brethren in particular, and having some boosted rules on the Land Raider Crusader datasheets probably won't hurt that either. I think I'm still going to guess that the third of the detachments might be the one that gets built around most. Land Raiders are good, but are also pretty enormous investment, and while there are some really good supporting rules here, quite a lot of stuff is just a little bit on the mid side. Easily seems strong enough for casual games to me. Will be fun to see if anyone manages to make this work on the competitive scene. Finally, for the third detachment, we've got the Companions of Vehemence. and this one maybe feels closest to being the natural successor of the Righteous Crusaders. Melee Assault Black Templars with a bit more of a focus on Chaplains and Judiciars leading their way into the fight. The Vows from Righteous Crusaders became the army rule, so this one gets a different detachment rule, re-rolling advanced rolls and re-rolling charge rolls, both of which are pretty handy things for a melee army in general, fairly reliable extra movement around the board, and while the re-rolling charge rolls might not necessarily change the way the army functions in a huge way, it is just quite a nice quality of life thing. You never have to budget a command point re-roll for a charge, as you'll always be able to re-roll it, and when you inevitably fail one, it won't drain the command point resources, so you can plug that into elsewhere. I still wouldn't say it's the single most impactful detachment rule, but will be useful. For stratagems, for one command point, we have the return of Devout Push. This one allows you to pile in and consolidate 6 inches. The pile in useful to get more models into the fight or tag other stuff potentially. The consolidate potentially nice to jump back to objectives or tag the next unit in the enemy army and force them to either remain in combat or fall back. You can't combine this with the second stratagem unless the unit's led by a Chaplain or Judiciar. Definitely handy support for a melee army. The extra 3-inch range sometimes can be really impactful. The other consolidate manipulation one is Heart Hardened Duty. This allows you to consolidate towards the closest enemy unit rather than the closest enemy model. So this one's quite good if you've got a big massed up infantry unit where you want to be trying to engage as many as possible. That could give you some more options with where they move. And if you happen to have chosen the Suffer Not the Unclean to Live vow, you don't need to consolidate towards the nearest unit either, so you'd have plenty of options if you can get into engagement range. Again, a slightly technical melee one, allowing you to manipulate the flow of combat, and potentially good if there's multiple enemy units nearby. Potentially it could give you loads of freedom if you have that vow active and the big 6-inch consolidate as well. But at the same time, there's maybe only so much advantage in technical melee things. I feel like for people who aren't trying to game the maximum out of the fight phase and just are slamming units into each other, both of these might just get passed up. You're kind of unlikely to have that vow active as well as to mean passing up the +1 to wound one. And I wouldn't say that the boosted version of this stratagem is enough incentive to. For one command point, there's For the Emperor's Honour. This one allows your melee weapons to gain precision, which is a pretty big and useful one. Between an entire squad worth of Black Templars fighting, that should be enough just to annihilate most characters, and in particular very good for dealing with support characters that have big buffs or damage but kind of low defense. It's quite a lot more powerful than Epic Challenge, as you should be able to predict whether or not it's going to slay a character with at least some reliability. It's not reliably good against every foe and army, but there'll be enough situations where it should really matter. For one command point, there's Pious Enmity. This one gives your Chaplains or Judiciars units reroll 1s to hit in melee, and then boosted to reroll 1s to wound as well if you're in melee with a monster or vehicle. As with the previous reroll 1s to wound one, just rerolling hits is a fairly borderline buff, maybe only worth it if literally every bit of damage is absolutely vital and you're fighting with something super dangerous. If you're getting both the hits and wounds though, then it's significantly better, and I would treat this as one to use against tough stuff, but not against more normal units. Feels like Sword Brethren could be pretty murderous with this, potentially lethal hits from their own melee weapons, +1 to wound with the vow, and then both of these rerolls at the same time. Really quite a lot of punch against tough stuff. For one command point, there's Heresy Begets Retribution. This one's an interesting sort of reactive surge move. When the enemy moves within 9 inches of a Chaplain or Judiciar's unit, your unit may move d6 inches directly closer to them. It does this with the normal surge move style things, so you can end the move within engagement range. That could be particularly intimidating on a fight's first unit with the Judiciar, where they're going to be hitting the enemy before they hit you, even if they countercharge with another thing nearby. And potentially you could have quite a lot of movement with this between that and Righteous Zeal. Even if the enemy just toes to within 9 inches, there's a pretty reasonable chance that you could get in melee between this d6 and the Righteous Zeal's d6+2. Finally, for one command point, there's Dread Crusaders. When the enemy declares a charge against one of your infantry units, they must test Battle Shock at -1 to the test. This one's a bit on the niche side, but at -1 there's at least a reasonable chance they might fail, and with the sequence of it, it might prevent a command point reroll from taking effect, or some big melee damage stratagems if they fail. I guess if it's an absolutely game-changing charge that's a kind of long one, then it could be worth throwing a stratagem to have an attempt to prevent it. Then finally, perhaps some of the scarier things about the detachment are the enhancements. Incendiary Animus is printed at 25 points. This one you give to a Chaplain or a Judiciar, and it allows them to improve the AP of this model's melee weapons by 1. Really quite nice for something like an Execrator Chaplain or a Judiciar that don't normally have inbuilt melee buffs to their unit to suddenly get one. That's going to be really quite meaningful both for the Chaplain's melee and for the rest of the squad's melee. Sword Brethren at AP3 or Primaris Crusaders at AP2 are a big deal, particularly with their wound buffs on the go. Seems like that one could easily be worth it for the 25 points. Oathbound Exemplar is printed at 15 points. This one's for an infantry model, and you add +1 to your advanced rolls, and your unit can do actions after advancing. At 15 maybe feels a bit more borderline, perhaps could be okay as a points filler. The Execrator feels like they'd be a good choice for that, given that they can advance and charge. The other enhancements seem more impactful to me though. Next up, we've got Merciless Denunciation. This one's printed at 25 points. Again, this one is Chaplain or Judiceer only, and models in the bearer's unit can reroll hit rolls in melee. That one's a pretty nice buff there, probably better on things that hit on a 3+ natively, given the Sword Brethren get less value already hitting on a 2+. Seems pretty excellent on Crusader squads though, and I guess even though Sword Brethren still hit on 2s, they could use it to fish for lethal hits if they wanted to, just choosing to reroll everything that isn't a 6 versus anything they're wounding on a 5+. It does make them scarier against things that are toughness 10 or higher. Then finally there's Zealous Vanguard, that's printed at 20 points, and the bearer's unit gains Scout 6 inches. Again, hard to go too far wrong with that. The regular Primaris Crusaders have lost that rule, so this is one way to give it back to them. Generally with scary melee Black Templar things, it's nice to get them further and more threatening into the midboard. Maybe could be used with an Impulsor as well. Overall definitely feels like an interesting detachment. The core rule maybe doesn't feel super standout, but still will add reliable value. It maybe is a bit odd to have quite a lot of stratagems locked to the Chaplain and Judiceer datasheets. Grimaldus could be one way to get the stratagems with a good datasheet though. Actually, I feel like some of the most standout things are actually the enhancements, the Scout 6 inches, the melee hit rerolls, and the extra AP are all really quite nice boosts to fighty Black Templar units, really playing into their strengths. Feels like maybe Execrator Chaplains could be particularly interesting with this one. Lacking advance and charge is one downside, but they seem to fill the gaps quite nicely and can still provide a bunch of melee threat in their own right, plus be bearers for the enhancements. Those are the 3 new detachments in any case. I'd probably guess that the Companions of Vehemence might be the one that people look to more than the other two, maybe just for being a little bit more general purpose and the Chaplains being usable enough. Will be interesting to see what emerges on top. At first instincts, I feel like the core Codex Space Marine detachments also feel like they've got some good rivalry for this. Gladius and Stormlance do pretty well for melee things. I kind of wonder whether people might give a second look to Wrathful Procession as well, now that it's out of the shadow of Righteous Crusaders. I feel like in general for the detachments, the Black Templars maybe don't have the most powerful unique detachments out of any of the chapters, but they just gain a whole load of strength from their core detachment rule and their datasheets that have been upgraded. I'll certainly be interested to see what builds emerge on top for them when people choose to take them to tournaments. Let's move on to the other half of the codex though, and that's the datasheets. In 10th edition codexes, it usually tends to be a bit of give and take on the datasheet front. The Black Templars got 2 new models, so they've got new datasheets for the Execrator Chaplain and the Crusade Ancient, and then they've got Templar specific versions of the Land Raider Crusader, Sternguard Veteran Squad, and Terminator Squad, to add to the melter tanks that they already had. Looks like the Land Raider Crusader is purely there for theming, which is quite fun. The Sternguard and Terminators just purely because they interact with Oath of Moment, so it's just a bit of housekeeping really to change their special rule. The only datasheet lost out of the codex is the Firstborn Crusader Squad. There's now only the one Crusader Squad datasheet, which is just called Crusader Squad and represents the Primaris models. The Primaris ones were really more of a resculpt on that, as opposed to really being intended side by side for the long term. I guess the Firstborn Crusaders will get Legends rule support, at least in the meantime you could use them as tactical squads and scout squads and things, or just run them as the Primaris datasheet for the models that make sense for the loadouts. For the datasheets, that leaves us with these ones. For epic hero characters, we've got Helbrecht and Grimaldus. There's the Emperor's Champion, who isn't an epic hero anymore, but you can only take one. And then more regular generic characters in the Execrator, Crusade Ancient, Marshal and Castellan. For their squads, they've got the Crusader Squad and Sword Brethren, both big vocal units, the variant datasheets for the Sternguard Terminators and Land Raider Crusader, and then the multi-melter variant of the tanks with the 3 Gladiator chassis ones, the Impulsor, and then the Repulsor and Repulsor Executioner, both of which got some new special rules interestingly enough. Obviously their datasheet list is far bigger than this in reality. They can use all the things out of core Codex Space Marines. They might like some of these special rule infantry units, things like intercessors for sticky objectives, probably some scouts to hold down the midboard and do utility stuff, maybe the combi weapon lieutenant, and perhaps a bit of heavy fire support to deal with things at long range. They do have some good choices in Codex with their variant datasheets though. Without Oath of Moments, maybe the Gladiator Lancer is looking particularly tempting. Their Repulsor Executioner also has a fun rule. On top of that, they can also ally in Imperial Agents and Imperial Knights. A Calatus Assassin may be the single most likely thing to jump around the board doing secondary objectives. Obviously Imperial Knights have a whole bunch of raw strength at time of recording though. When talking about the datasheets, as ever with 40k 10th edition codexes, it's worth mentioning that the printed points in the book aren't final, but we'll include them here for sake of completion, but Games Workshop always change them to a greater or lesser extent with their digital downloads that follow the codex release. One example being of when the Guard Combat Engineers released in the book and they were 35 points, but when we got the first official digital rules they went up to 70. I'll certainly look forward to talking through the digital points costs for the Black Templars when we get them. I feel like somewhere between the printed points costs and the ones they were before are quite helpful as a guide to set some expectations. They can hint at some things that are going to be either going up or down. Let's get into their datasheets though, and we'll start out with the 2 new characters, then go on to talk through the infantry units, mainly focusing on the unique ones, then the characters, and then their vehicle variants. First up, we've got the fighty chaplain that is the Execrator Chaplain. He's got the same stat line as a regular chaplain in Codex Space Marines, 4 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save. He is only locked to leading the Crusader Squad and Sword Brethren, so a little bit less generous than some of the other unique Templar units, which can lead things like Assault Intercessors and Friends. He gets the same Crozius attacks that the regular Chaplain gets, 5 attacks at Strength 6, AP 1 and Damage 2, plus an Absolver Bolt Pistol. Then basically for his War Gear bonus, you either get to choose a Pyre Pistol to upgrade the Absolver into essentially a Pistol Flamer, or take an additional Mastercrafted Power Weapon, which seems like the clear choice if you want to make him scary in melee, as that gives him an extra 3 attacks, hitting on a 2+, at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2, with extra attacks and lethal hits. So essentially he's an 8 attack chaplain, with those Mastercrafted Power Sword attacks being pretty punchy. That does seem to have been one of the more consistent changes in the Black Templar Codex, that basically everywhere that there's a Power Sword it's become a Mastercrafted Power Sword, and it gains lethal hits. Then for his buffing rules, he gets Remorseless Persecution, Advance and Charge while this model is leading a unit, and I feel like that one is actually quite a good buff to have, given that it's not directly available in the Codex detachments, so having these guys in units could be quite a big deal. Then otherwise his second buff is called Condemnatory Annihilation. If this model's unit destroys an enemy unit in the fight phase, enemy units within 6 inches must test Battle Shock after this guy's unit has resolved its attacks. That's a pretty narrow window for that to be any use whatsoever, as enemy units will recover their Battle Shock automatically at the start of their next turn. It's really going to be quite niche that ever does anything. Kind of a shame that he didn't have a different buffing rule. For his Codex printed points cost, he's listed at 70 points. So basically for that, you're getting a whole bunch of damage 2 attacks, I guess with +1 to wound most of the time against tough stuff, and advance and charge into the unit, and it does seem like he'd be a particularly helpful one for the chaplain-focused Companions of Vehemence. It doesn't get advance and charge, several stratagems and enhancements need chaplains, and he's pretty reasonable there given that the regular chaplain's a little bit superseded by the army rule. Overall, with that context, I feel like he will be a useful unit for the army. It is maybe a shame that he won't be able to combine with things like Castellans though. If you want 2 characters in the unit, you can take him and the Crusade Ancient, but you can't combine with things like Marshals or Castellans. Talking of the Crusade Ancient, he's the other new character, the big banner bearer with either a shield on the front or an orc skull. Quite a fun knightly helm on him. He's got a 4 wound profile without an invulnerable save, can attach to Crusader Squads and Sword Brethren once again, and as mentioned he can join a unit that's led by one other character, either a Captain, Chapter Master, Lieutenant or Execrator. For an Ancient, he actually hits a little bit harder in melee than I might have guessed, 5 attacks hitting on a 2+, at Strength 5, AP 2 and Damage 2, and all with lethal hits. That's a melee profile to rival or beat other factions' Captain equivalent, which is pretty impressive, at least far more so than other banner bearers. In the Codex, his points cost is listed at 65 points, so a little bit more on the pricey side. And again, maybe like the Execrator Chaplain, while his core stats are fairly punchy for a character, he feels like he's got one good special rule and then one that's a lot more mid. His main one is Vengeful Exaltation, and this one allows your units to fight on death on a 4+ if they're destroyed before they've fought this turn. Fight on Death is a really powerful one against enemy melee armies. If you are leading some Crusaders or Sword Brethren into battle, then it means that you might drag down a bunch of the enemy as they get wiped out. But it's going to depend on what charged you. For Crusaders, they might have some limited damage against tough stuff, and against gun lines it's not really going to do much as they're not going to be killing you in close combat in the first place. His other buff just really isn't that great. Martial Honor gives him an extra 5 objective control. If his unit manages to wipe out an enemy unit at some point, that base still just starts with OC1. I feel like they probably could have been a bit more generous on that front. Maybe have that as a bonus on top of the usual Ancient +1 objective control thing that they normally do, or start him on more objective control and then just get more if he actually kills something. For objective claiming, it just doesn't really seem as helpful. Overall, I feel like he's probably going to be quite niche outside the Vindication detachment, which basically builds around him entirely. I guess the idea for that one is that you could have multiple ancient banner bearers leading multiple Crusader squads and grabbing the midboard, with quite a lot of supporting options based around banner bearers. New units aside, getting into their two mainline units, we've got the Crusader Squad and the Sword Brethren. The Crusader Squad pre-Codex were 150 points or 310, printed they're 150 or 300. It will be quite nice if they remove the tax for the bigger units, particularly now the big feel no pains that they could get aren't really a thing. In the squad you get 4 neophytes for every 6 initiates, the neophytes being the scout bodies with the 4+ armour and either neophyte firearms versus chainswords, and the initiates taking chainswords and getting the power armoured save. They're a battle line choice and they're OC2. Most of the time when I've seen people using these, it's generally tended to be with Astartes chainswords. They've got 1 for your attack on this datasheet at 4 attacks, but all the chainswords gain sustained hits 1, so that sort of balances out there. 2 models in the unit can take a power fist for a bit of extra punch, and now the sword brother leading the unit gets a mastercrafted power weapon, so 3 attacks hitting on a 2 at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, so that gained a bit more punch for the sergeant. For both the Sword Brethren and the Crusader Squad, they didn't do the Space Wolves thing, which was to lock them only to being led by units in the Codex, and I think that is quite a nice thing to see. Characters can still attach to them if they're intercessors, so you could still have lieutenants or captains in the mix. Lieutenants giving lethal hits could be quite a nice one for them with all those melee attacks. Otherwise, they have had some changes to their special rules. They're no longer scout 6 inches, so won't be on quite such aggressive footing in the midboard, and they've lost their reroll charges. What they have gained instead though is Righteous Zeal coming back in a way that harks back to past versions of the rule. In the enemy shooting phase, when the unit gets shot, they can make a d6 plus 2-inch surge move directly towards the nearest non-aircraft enemy unit. This one allows to bring them into engagement range, though it won't count as having charge. You can only use it once per turn, and you can't use it if the unit's battle shocked. It's still a pretty massively scary rule though for a fighting melee unit, potentially with characters attached to it. It means that if the opponent wants to move into the midboard and then something shoots the unit, then this squad can just immediately step up to them and engage them in close combat if they roll high enough. At minimum, if they're within 4 inches, then you automatically get into close combat, and they could engage all the way up to 9 if you roll a 6. Overall, it definitely seems like a pretty powerful supporting rule for a squad that wants to be fighting on the midboard objectives. The opponent's going to have to think about how they deal with them just that bit more, and they could potentially just turn off shooting if they wander into melee with something, and then they're in engagement range so you can't fire at them anymore. They won big out of the core rule change as well. With a strength of 4, they're going to be wounding almost everything on a +1 to wound with those chainswords. Quite nice to have chainswords just routinely wounding heavy battle tanks and knights on a 5+. Overall, definitely looking like an interesting battle line unit for the Templars. Obviously, depending on their points, they have lost some other supporting rules, such they won't be able to be getting any big 5+ feel no pains from either Grimaldus or Turnhouse's Bones, both of which have had those options removed. And as an aside, there are still some bits of weirdness for the datasheets. It still seems that the initiates get 2 different bolt pistols. They can fire with a heavy one and also a regular one in the same turn. And the Pyreblaster hasn't got the extra AP that the Infernus Marines got. I don't know if that's aimed to be a datasheet thing for them, or whether or not it's just a change that happened later after the Templar Codex was finalised. Next up, we've got the Primaris Sword Brethren, the elite of the chapter. These guys are 3 wound Space Marines and some fairly heavy melee damage dealers. Previously, there were 140 points per 5 of them, and 270 per 10. It seems the Codex has given you some different units in which you can field different numbers of them. You've now got the options to field them in either squads of 4 or squads of 9. The squad leader was previously called a Castellan, and basically you're able to just field him as an independent character in his own right now. I guess you always could have used him as the Castellan datasheets for the army, but similar to some other kits in 40k, if you buy some Sword Brethren and field the Castellan separately, you can still field the remaining 4 Sword Brethren as their own unit. In theory, it could be interesting to have a smaller squad if you want a slightly more minimum investment melee damage dealer to escort a character. So if you want any of their fancy gear, that mainly becomes available 1 per every 5 models, so it does look like there's some good incentive to bump them up to 5. Their damage profiles have had really quite a big shift around. They no longer have a special rule that amps up their damage, but a fair bit of their threat has been moved onto their stat line. The regular Sword Brothers are a lot more effective without any buffs. 3 attacks that hit on a 2+ now rather than a 3, all at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, and they also get lethal hits, which all round them out a lot better against tougher stuff. Overall, it does feel like quite a lot of side grades to the unit. Some things lost and some things gained. They won't be helping out characters with +1 damage anymore, and they won't have any damage 3 attacks natively. They won't get the +1 damage on the Thunderhammer, but on the other hand, all the other weapons hit on a +1 to hit compared with what they were before too. Their base weapon skill is 2+. Between the lethal hits and the damage 2, I kind of wonder whether or not people might just be going for entire squads worth of master-crafted power weapons. Probably the Thunderhammer is still going to be overall worth it for the strength differential plus the devastating wounds, but the Mastercrafted does get the lethal hits plus the weapon skill 2+. In any case, either way, it's still going to be the central mainline damage dealer for a whole bunch of character units for the army. I still guess they'll be the go-to there. They still seem probably superior to Blade Guard to me at first impressions, though I guess we'll wait and see. They do have some draws as well. Otherwise, for smaller changes, the rule that replaced their +1 damage thing is quite a lot weaker. It's called Exploit Their Cowardice, and it allows you to do a normal move if the enemy falls back from you and they're no longer in engagement range. So you could potentially go rushing towards an objective marker or hide out of line of sight or something. Characters can still attach to them as if they were intercessors, so still lots of options there for other datasheets to lead. Judas still look like they're going to be a good option. And otherwise for minor changes, both they and the Crusader Squad lost the Primaris tagline to their name, and the Sword Brethren can no longer take a combi weapon anymore. I guess them deciding that that's the build for the Castellan as opposed to the mainline squad, that maybe just seems a little bit on the annoying side to take it away. Next up, and likely a fair bit less mainstream for the Templars, we've got the Sternguard and the Terminator datasheets. As mentioned, the only reason that Templars get a Sternguard datasheet is because their core special rule revolves around Oath of Moment, so they had to have a new one. Given that Black Templars don't have Oath of Moment, their datasheet is otherwise very similar. 2 wounds with a whole bunch of devastating wound firepower, and then quite a lot of volume close combat attacks in melee. They've changed their special rule from reroll all wound rolls against the Oath of Moment targets to just reroll wound rolls of 1 against the closest targets. It means that that'll often be triggering, so just very slightly more dangerous. And it does seem that the squad might well cost less. Their printed points cost in the Codex is 85 points per 5 of them, which I feel like overall between a whole bunch of devastating wound bolter fire plus a bit more melee than you might expect out of a skirmish unit, that could be enough. I still guess they might be second pick to things like intercessors with a sticky objectives rule from a practical point of view though. Overall I suspect they'd be niche, but given wound rerolls and the +1 to wound in melee, they could be a surprisingly good general purpose brawler unit, even if they're not that tough. Next up, we've got the Black Templar version of the Terminator Squad. The Codex Space Marine one is 170 points. The printed cost for the Templar one is 175. Terminators for core Codex Space Marines have generally tended to be a bit on the niche side. Not completely unusable for their damage and defensive stats, but rarely making it into strong lists. The core Space Marine datasheet gets Fury of the First, +1 to hit against the Oath of Moment target, and the Templars swap it out for making enemy units test Desperate Escape when they fall back, and with the usual debuff that if the enemy unit's battle shocks, then they're -1 to that test. It's not an awful datasheet rule, and occasionally it could make some interesting decisions. The opponent can always choose the best thing for them though, either staying in melee if it works better, or falling back and just losing a chunk of the squad. If that's the better option, they're in control, and it also doesn't work on monsters and vehicles as well, so less relevant against certain armies. Overall feels like a bit of a side grade for Terminators. I wouldn't really expect them to be any more standout for the Templars compared with anywhere else at first impressions. Next up, we've got the rest of the Mighty Templar characters, and first up we have High Marshal Helbrecht himself, Chapter Master of the Black Templars, and an absolute powerhouse in melee. Pre-Codex he was 120 points, and particularly nasty with Sword Brethren, who helped him out via their datasheet rule. I guess that won't be happening anymore, but he's still got loads of melee threat, and I guess will be +1 to wound against a bunch of tough stuff now. Helbrecht is a 6 wound Chapter Master with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save. Previously it was 5, so he gained 1 extra wound in this update. It's also been updated to 3 OC and Leadership 6, so a little bit more presence on the objectives for his little attendant service I suppose, but also a more normal character leadership stat. At range he gets Ferocity, a punchy combi weapon with anti-infantry 4+, devastating wounds and a couple of heavy bolter style shots, and in melee he has the Sword of the High Marshals, 12 attacks at strength 6, AP 3 and damage 1 if you try and 2-handle hordes, or boosted to 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3 if you're taking down tough stuff. While he's leading a unit, he'll give you +1 strength and +1 attack to melee weapons, so in reality it's usually going to be 7 attacks at strength 9 on that boosted profile, or very fearsome indeed. And both those boosts are very meaningful both for the Primaris Crusaders and the Sword Brethren. Going to strength 5 and strength 6 respectively are both meaningful breakpoints, and the extra attack seems particularly good for Sword Brethren now that they have 3 base. Then his High Marshal ability for a whole bunch of mortal wounds has also been improved. At the start of the fight phase he basically just punches the enemy for a bunch of mortal wounds, On a 2 or 3 he gets D3, on a 4 or 5 you get 3, and on a 6 you get D3 plus 3. This now gets boosted per the amount of models that he has in the unit, adding 1 to the roll per 5 models in the unit. So if he's leading a big massed up Crusader squad, there's a pretty reasonable chance he's going to get that D3 plus 3 mortal wounds, and if he's leading a squad of any size, then it's just amped up the damage output pretty massively. In the Codex, it's also printed as being less points than before. He's listed at 100 as opposed to 120. I wouldn't be too surprised if his points cost dropped a bit to reflect this. He's still a very fighty and efficient and good buffing character. He's going to be excellent in close combat, though he maybe isn't going to reach the absolutely crazy heights that he could before between stacking rules from Sword Brethren and other stuff. Overall though, at the right points cost, him plus a unit of Sword Brethren is still going to absolutely demolish things. Next up, we've got Chaplain Grimaldus, the hero of Hive Hell's Reach in Armageddon, is a 4-wound chaplain, and he has 3 Cenobite servitors to accompany him, his entire unit getting a 5+ Feel No Pain and a 4+ Invulnerable save, and those individual servitor models could actually add a fair bit of durability to a unit, potentially tanking some really big hits that might have slain Space Marines otherwise, perhaps even more so with their invulnerable saves. He gets a plasma pistol and an Artificer Crozius, that's gained 1 extra attack, so it's now 6 attacks at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2. His base melee buff is to allow units to reroll the hit roll, which is nice enough. That's particularly in the context of Black Templars getting wound boosts against everything. Maybe getting those hits is more important than it was, and it could still be interesting for Sword Brethren potentially to allow them to fish for lethals when it makes sense to. Otherwise though, his interesting rule is the Templar Relics. While at least 1 Cenobite servitor lives, you have the choice of 3 different buffs selected in your command phase, either a +1 to advance and charge rolls made for the unit, a +1 to the unit's toughness, or improving the AP of weapons in the unit by 1. It does mean that he has been a bit downgraded on that. Previously the big standout one was the Feel No Pain 5+ that he could have, but that's gone away. +1 toughness is still useful but not quite that good. And previously he could allow the unit to advance and charge, now it's just +1 to advance and charge. Still useful to get the squad to melee, and maybe a bit more so in detachments like Gladius or Stormlance where he can advance and charge natively. Previously I think he was charged at a real premium thanks to the Feel No Pain. Now without that, I suspect he's going to be cheaper, and the Codex printed points do imply that too. He's listed at 100 points as opposed to 120. I think he is still going to have some stiff competition with the other characters as there's plenty of good ones, but for that cost between the nuisance factor of the Cenobite servitors, his own melee with the Artificer Crozius, potentially reroll hits and extra AP, all the toughness for a big Crusader squad, it does seem like he's got enough to make him interesting. Perhaps one of the most heavily rewritten datasheets is the Emperor's Champion. He's 75 points. Previously he was a leader unit for Crusader Squads, Sword Brethren, Intercessors, Assault Intercessors and Sternguard. He can still lead all of those, but now he also has the option to go solo and be a lone operative, and really quite a fighty and punchy one at that. For his stat line, he's still a 2+ save with a 4+ invulnerable, has 5 wounds, though he has got a bit faster. He moves 8 inches rather than 6 at base, and that is quite useful. If he's going solo as a lone operative, then it means he could get around the board that bit quicker, and if he's in a unit, you could potentially have him starting alongside his squad, and then basically range out the front, so he should be able to shorten the charge range that his squad needs if you get to move before charging. For his damage, he still has the Black Sword, a choice of sweeps and strikes maybe not so dissimilar to Helbrecht's. The big punchy profile is 6 attacks, hitting on a 2+ at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3, or with precision to snipe out enemy characters, and also anti-character 5+ now. Usually anti-character 5+ isn't actually going to mean anything, but it interacts with a special rule for devastating wounds. Once per game, the model's melee weapons gain devastating wounds if in melee with a character unit, and you also get +2 to charge against character keyword units on top of that. It does mean that he could be a better character killer if he is in close combat with something with some good saves, as every 5 and 6 gets converted to mortal wounds and will go through all barriers. Otherwise, he's had a small buff to his skillful pally. He is able to parry bullets now, as his once per game blanker failed save now works against ranged attacks as well as melee, and to be fair to Games Workshop, it has been renamed to Armour of Faith. The only major loss that is taken on his profile is that he's no longer innately a +1 to wound all characters, so that might have some effect against things that are say around toughness 5 to toughness 7. Against any big tough characters like say character tanks or knights and things though, he's still going to be +1 to wound due to him being able to use the Templar Vows for that. Overall, if he does indeed remain the 75 points that he's printed at, he looks like he's received a pretty massive buff. The movements is nice, his defensive rule is better, the devastating wounds thing is helpful enough, and the lone operative thing gives him another very interesting way to use him. Certainly seems like he'd rival a combi weapon lieutenant pretty well, just for the sheer amount of destructiveness. He's also no longer an epic hero anymore, even if you can only still take one of him per army, and that means that you could give him enhancements if it made sense to. Always nice to see perhaps one of the single most iconic Black Templar models doing well, and I guess new players will probably be feeling good about the purchase in the Combat Patrol. Next up, we've got the sort of Captain and Lieutenant equivalents of the Black Templars, the Marshal and Castellan. Previously, these had datasheets that were just very similar to the core Codex Space Marine Captain and Lieutenant, the same special rules but with just some slightly different war gear, though it seems that Games Workshop's chosen to take them in a very different direction in this book. The Marshal previously was 75 points, printed in book he's 80, and he still has the standard Space Marine Captain style profile, with a choice of a combi weapon or plasma pistol as per the model. His melee has been improved quite a bit though, he now has a massive 7 attacks at base, all hitting on a 2+ at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, and like the other mastercrafted power weapons in the book, he's also picked up lethal hits on that. Also taking into account the fact that he's probably going to be +1 to wound at anything that's toughness 5 or higher, that's a massive melee glow up. A good potential to be taking out entire squads worth of Space Marines and stack far more damage on tough targets than he would have been able to before. That's not all for helping out his own melee though, as he also gives his unit critical hits on a 5+, a rule that is only going to apply to certain units or if he is tag teaming with a lieutenant. But on the standard Primaris Crusaders, they have chainswords with sustained hits, so it'll be meaningful there. And for the Sword Brethren, their standard mastercrafted power weapons are lethal hits, so maybe a good incentive just to run an entire full squad of those, and basically have both him and his TIE unit auto-wounding on a 5+ whenever he attacks something. Overall, a whole load more threat on just his pure stats. He doesn't do free stratagems anymore though, you still have to get a regular captain to be able to do that, and that still is an option if you'd want. And his stealth buffing damage special rule isn't quite as good as the captain's one. That one's +3 attacks and devastating wounds. This one's +1 attack per enemy unit within 6 inches to a max of 3. I guess it's still potentially good for at least 1 more extra attack, and he has gained 1 more just at base all the time, which is great, but certainly no longer quite such a powerful rule versus his standard stat line. Overall, if you just want a Black Templar unit that hits really hard though, then he seems hard to go too far wrong with. Just a brutal amount of auto-wounding attacks out of some Sword Brethren, loads of sustained hits and potentially lethal hits as well if he combos with a lieutenant in the Primaris Crusader squads, and the Castellan could be an interesting choice as well for re-rolling hits to try and get more of those 5+ criticals. Speaking of which, the Templar style Castellan has also received some similar sort of rules changes. He's also got the boosted mastercrafted power weapon profile. That one goes at 6 attacks, so is still really quite fighty, and also gets lethal hits on his profile. You can back that up with either a heavy bolt pistol or a combi weapon. Previously he had the lieutenant style buffing rules, so the lethal hits for his units and then the fallback shoot and charge, both of which are good, and again you can still use lieutenants as an equivalent or even just run the Castellan model as one, but he has still had interesting rules to replace it. His main damage buffing rule is re-rolling hit rolls. He gets to re-roll hit rolls in melee all the time, but if when his unit's selected to fight you can pass a leadership test, then it goes up to re-rolling all hits. So usually with Space Marine leadership being a 6+, that's going to happen around about 3/4 of the time. The full hit rerolls could certainly be big and meaningful for the Primaris Crusaders, and as mentioned could be extra good if he is tag teamed in a Sword Brethren unit alongside a Marshal. That means that if you take the mastercrafted power weapons, they've got lethal hits on a 5+, and then the Castellan could allow you to reroll all hit rolls that aren't a 5+, so you're basically getting at least half the unit's attacks in automatic wounds. It's still going to be excellent for the Primaris Crusaders as well, basically converting the vast majority of their chainsword attacks to hits, a bunch of which get to be sustained hits, and then it's going to be an incredibly dangerous flurry of chainsword attacks, as there'll be +1 to wound literally everything that isn't toughness 3. Vehicles are still going to feel that amount of volume attacks when they're wounded on a 5+. Between that and being a cheap character with a good personal melee profile, it feels like the Castellan and the Marshal are both really interesting ones if you just want hit squads to hit enormously hard. I must admit it does feel a bit on the peculiar side though, that these are really not incentivized quite so much by the detachments, lots of things requiring either the Ancient or the Chaplain keyword to make work. Overall though, he seems like a really punchy datasheet, and his second special rule allows you to potentially farm some command points from time to time, a 4+ chance to gain a command point if his squad is able to destroy something in melee. Then finally we've got the Templar Tanks and Vehicles. There's the Land Raider Crusader and then the Multi-Melter Tanks. Again, in the Codex, just for housekeeping really, there's a multi-melter on the Black Templar upgrade sprue, and that allows you to upgrade a top turret with one of those. Usually the option is to choose between an Iron Hail Heavy Stubber or a multi-melter, which is a much punchier and far more threatening gun. And as a result, the Black Templar datasheets are in here, pretty much the same as the core Codex Space Marines before, and just costing 10 points more for the upgraded weapon. For those ones, it seems that the Gladiators and the Impulsor still have that. The Impulsor feels like a particularly efficient little transport, paying 10 points for an extra multi-melter, being a pretty effective transport in its own right, and then getting Sword Brethren or maybe Blade Guard into the fight. The Templar Gladiators are about as effective as they would be anywhere else. The multi-melter does well to double down on the theme of the Gladiator Valiant, though it's not really considered the strongest variant. It's quite a nice add-on to the Gladiator Lancer maybe, giving that thing yet more threat is pretty scary. It's meant that in the past, Ironstorm Spearhead could sometimes be weirdly good for Black Templars, giving you one punchy extra gun that could be a good target for some good rerolls. Pre-Codex, they all cost 10 points more than the regular Space Marine version. Printed points in the Codex have them at the same price, though I guess we'll see what Games Workshop do with the digital points cost. I wouldn't be surprised if they still remain 10 points higher. As well as the boosted Land Raider Crusader though, there have been changes to two of them, with the Repulsor and Repulsor Executioner both getting their own different datasheet rules. Starting with those, the regular Repulsor certainly enjoys having an extra multi-melter for a bit more threat. It's already quite a general purpose pile of guns in the first place with a big transport capacity, could be reasonable enough to charge out of, though the Black Templar melee things often get on well with Land Raiders or maybe Impulsors for smaller units like Sword Brethren. The regular Space Marine Repulsor has the rule that allows you to jump back inside it when a ranged unit is being charged. Quite a handy one to support things like Eradicators or Hellblasters. The Templar want to swap that out though, it's a bit more aggressive, and it basically allows you to reactively disembark out to 6 inches when the Repulsor gets shot in the enemy shooting phase. It's a rule that could sometimes be helpful, though I feel like most of the time it just probably wouldn't make sense to do that. Generally valuable units are best off safe inside the tank where the enemy can't shoot or charge them later in the turn, but maybe could be handy to say threaten a heroic intervention or put some more bodies on an objective, or even do other things like potentially block a charge unexpectedly. It feels like an unusual move that you'd have to have a bit of creative thinking behind being able to make good use of it, and I feel like most of the time it's just going to make more sense to stay in the great big tank. It still doesn't seem like an overall bad datasheet with a Repulsor with a multi-melter on top of it, though I feel like the special rule doesn't add too much. Perhaps more interesting is the Templar Repulsor Executioner. This one's the version with the great big powerful gun on the top, most commonly a laser destroyer in the armies that don't have boosted oath at the moment where there might be a bit more debate. On top of that you also get heavy onslaught Gatling cannons and a bunch of secondary support weapons, really quite a big general purpose threatening tank. The special rule for this one though is a lot more useful than the regular Repulsor Executioner. It allows you to reroll shooting hit rolls if you target a unit that's within 12 inches of a friendly Astartes model. That's pretty massive to have on quite such a big direct damage dealer in the first place, and a really easy buff to have on the enemy. It won't be great for plinking enemy tanks in the backfield, but for providing fire support into enemies pushing the midfield it's rather good, and just impressively better than the buff that it gets against very damaged enemy units in the regular codex. It certainly could be a draw to take this one, though I guess to some extent it might just be a bit of a trade-off with not being able to access Oath of the Moment, as a lot of the time it might have made sense to activate those full hit rerolls on your biggest firepower anyway. If you do want a bit of heavy fire support for a Black Templar army list though, this does look fairly standout, rerolling all hits plus the bonus multi-melter. Finally though, for the vehicle datasheets, we've got quite a fun one in the Templar Land Raider Crusader. Despite it being the Templar's iconic tank variant with the enormous hold and the Hurricane bolters, it just hasn't really been all that strong in 10th edition. It's just typically made sense to either upgrade to the las cannons for the Godhammer variants, or perhaps more likely the hard-hitting Flamestorm cannons of the Redeemer. It seems that Games Workshop wanted to give you some incentive to actually take the Land Raider Crusader though, and as a result they've given it a fairly powerful special rule. It doesn't seem to trade off anything for that. The rest of the datasheet is as you'd expect, a big toughness 16, 12 wound beast with a whole load of bolt shots with Hurricane bolters with twin linked, a twin assault cannon, and then the assault ramp special rule so you can move, then drop, then your unit can charge. When they're charging in and jumping out of the Land Raider though, they're going to be hitting extra hard, as it's got a special rule called Legacy of Gerulus. After the model is shot, you mark one enemy unit that the Land Raider Crusader hit, and then models that disembark from it that attack the same unit this turn get to reroll ones to hit and wound, and that's both at range and in melee. As with other places, that effectively adds up to a 36% damage boost if you don't have other complicating things like existing rerolls or lethal hits, but overall it is a pretty sizable damage buff, and on something super dangerous like Sword Brethren or a big character supported Crusader Squad, I think that will be enough to perhaps tempt you to use the Land Raider Crusader as opposed to one of the more expensive variants. I still maybe suspect that for optimised tournament list it might be a bit borderline, but definitely has some other solid draw in the Godhammer formation. I still just be a little apprehensive as to whether or not it's going to be a good idea to invest 220 points into something that's only really good against sort of light to medium infantry. Still though, I think it's really quite fun that they've included this here. I feel like it's the sort of thing that Games Workshop could afford to do a bit more with the Space Marine codexes, and basically giving the Black Templars a bit of a feel-good special rule for their most iconic tank, and one that just doesn't really see all that much play elsewhere in the Space Marine world. Overall, between all that, I feel like it's a pretty interesting codex. Definitely a fair amount of revisions to the army, some better, some worse. Though overall, I feel like the reception to it has been at least fairly good. The army rule, I think, is quite a nice one. Maybe a shame that they didn't make the competing vows a bit better, but just the +1 to wound one seems like a massive win. That adds a lot of strength to the fighting melee of the faction. Detachments wise, I feel like they've all got really interesting things. Just a few standout things per detachment, though quite a lot have some pretty niche stuff mixed in as well. I might guess to start with that the Chaplain and Judicia style companions one might take off as the way to play. I'm genuinely kind of unsure about that though, and I wonder if Templars might still be tempted by Gladius. It did feel like a weird decision on the detachments to have everything at least somewhat locked to one datasheet or another, where it maybe feels like the most encouraged datasheets stats-wise are the Marshals and Castellans. Otherwise though, the datasheets seem solid enough. U-Star Sword Brethren I still think are going to be adequately dangerous between their layered special rules, between the army rule and their lethal hits. The regular Crusader squads are really going to like the army rule as well. Chainswords are going to be more dangerous when they can wound everything that bit better. Their surge move mechanic is going to cause problems as well, even if they're not going to be quite so indomitable with their feel no pains. I feel like the vast majority of the characters seem interesting enough on their datasheets. The Emperor's Champion maybe particularly so. Helbrecht still seems awesome, and as do the Castellan and Marshal. I feel like maybe the new datasheets perhaps are looking for the detachments to encourage you to take them. The Execrator does bring advance and charge, which the Templar detachments don't at the moment. And then the Templar Tanks definitely add a touch of interest on top of that. Multi-melter Impulsors I'm sure will remain good. Multi-melter Repulsor Executioners with big built-in rerolls probably look like one of the single strongest fire support things that the faction can buy in. And the Land Raider Crusader is really quite a cool and fun one to see a nice buff to support melee charging out of it. Overall, it'll be interesting to see what sort of units and combos make the cut. I'd guess that both the Crusaders and the Sword Brethren will get a look in. I'll be interested to talk through some tournament lists once we get them though. In any case, looking forward to hearing your takes on the Black Templar Codex. What are you most excited to put on the tabletop? Let me know down in the comments below. I'll leave this one there for now though. A big thank you to Toy Snowman in Canada for sponsoring the video. If you're looking to pick up some Black Templars or other stuff, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. They've got 15% off Warhammer. And for people looking to pick up combat patrols, new characters and codexes and things, they'll be going on sale around the world at these times. Midnight Eastern Time in North America, 10 AM at Element Games in the UK, 11 AM at Taschengeldieb in Germany and the EU, and then midday in Gap Games in Australia. Check out the channel affiliates for some discounts down in the video description, and a massive thank you to anyone using those as it helps to support Auspex tactics. I'll leave that there for now though. A big thank you for listening. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel more directly, I do have a Patreon page as well. That's links down in the video description, and channel patrons get a few benefits including entry to the regular monthly prize giveaways. Check that out down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over it. But in any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.